Hello, my name is Nathan Ersman, and I will be reading for you the first chapter of my novel, currently available on Amazon, titled The Dragons Rising. Falkir, a woman's voice called. Falkir, come to me, Falkir! Falkir sat up and brushed the golden hair from his dark blue eyes, finding himself in a vast meadow of flowers. As far as the eye could see, bright heads poked up from the ground and blanketed the landscape in color. They were likely fragrant, but Falkir wouldn't have known that since he was born in Osmic, lacking a sense of smell. The scene reminded Falkir of the countryside near his childhood home near Aes Sedai, where Falkir would traverse the woods and meadows with his two elder brothers during the growing season. Falkir rose from the ground slowly. He stepped forwards and immediately stopped, feeling a large, dense object at his feet. Looking to the ground, Falkir found a curious sword and scabbard of excellent workmanship. He reached down and picked up the scabbard. The ends of the sword's iron crossbar gracefully curved, forming a pair of knuckle bows back towards the pommel, which contained a black jewel darker than Falkir had ever seen before. The hilt was wrapped with black leather and bore an odd, curved symbol in the center of the grip that Falkir did not recognize. The weapon's hilt protruded from an equally curious scabbard made of the same black leather and embossed with the same symbol. It had obviously been crafted specifically for the weapon that resided within. Holding the scabbard in his right hand, Falkir reached to draw the sword and view the blade, but withdrew his hand when it was nicked by the knuckle bow, which Falkir now observed had been forged with a bladed edge. He examined his hand and found it wasn't a very deep cut, just a flesh wound. He could worry about it later. Carefully this time, he slid his hand onto the grip of the sword and withdrew the weapon from its host. The blade did not gleam when the sun hit it, despite being forged of well-worked steel that was as clean and perfect as if it had been newly forged. The sword was engraved along the center of the blade with two intertwined serpentine dragons, with the curved symbol from the hilt and scabbard between the open maws of the two dragons. Giving it a few practice swings, he began to wonder who would have left such an amazing sword just lying on the ground like that. Even with his lack of any swordsmanship experience, he could tell it was as deadly as it was beautiful. It would be as perfect on the battlefield as it would be hanging above the fireplace in a noble's home. He swung it through the flowers, cleanly cutting them in half. Falkir examined the apparently perfect sword, looking for any flaw whatsoever. The only defect he could find was a very small scratching on the blade where someone had written their name, Jesus. This Jesus man must have been a fool if he left this out here in the grass, Falkir thought aloud. Looking around, Falkir said, "Of course, where is here?" "Falkir," the voice called pleadingly, causing him to jump. He had almost forgotten about the voice. But where was it coming from? There was nobody in sight and, besides the sword, no sign that anybody had ever been here before. He took a few tentative steps towards where he thought he heard the voice coming from, then stopped to listen for it again. Nothing. "Hello?" he shouted, trying to call whomever was calling out to him. "Where are you? Are you hurt? Why do you need me?" His questions were answered only by a gentle breeze. "This is ridiculous. If this person needs me, then why are they choosing to ignore me?" He sheathed the sword and started walking, determined to figure out where he was and who wanted him. Falkir began to realize that with the exception of the voice, the meadow had no signs of life. There were no birds chirping, no bees buzzing, or even the sound of a far-off boar grunting in the dirt. The meadow sounded empty. Looking over the horizon, he could see no trees or any evidence that the meadow had an end. There were only flowers. Not even bushes seemed to be growing in the meadow. How far did it go? It couldn't be endless. That would be impossible. But it certainly seemed that way. As pretty as they were, Falkir had no problem stomping through the multitudes of flowers towards where the voice had been calling. The meadow that at first had seemed very pleasant had now become quite a nuisance. Every step that he took was taking him closer to the seemingly non-existent end of the meadow and a person whose location he didn't know. Not having heard it recently, the beckoning voice now seemed not to have been as urgent. He began to wonder if the voice was just in his own mind. As if on cue, the voice cried out again, "Falkir! Falkir! Falkir!" He looked up and saw the silhouette of a woman running towards him on the horizon. He opened his mouth to say something, but he didn't know what to call the woman or even what he should say. He had no idea what she wanted from him, or who she even was. Gripping the sheathed sword tighter in his hand, Falkir began to sprint toward her. Why was he going to her anyway? What did she want with him? Unless these flowers were poisonous to the touch, there weren't any clear dangers. Of course, what else did he have to do in this endless expanse of flowers but to run to the only other person in this strange place? As the distance between them shortened, Falkir could see that the woman was of average height with very dark, almost black hair. The clothes she wore were plain, a loose, unadorned green dress and a brown cloak. She wore glasses which reflected the sun's light into Falkir's eyes, causing him to squint to protect them from the blinding flashes of light. He almost couldn't help but think that she reminded him of his mother, Drinka, who had nurtured him from birth and protected him from his older brothers when he was young. In fact, the closer the woman got to Falkir, the more and more she looked like his mother. When she finally came into clear view, Falkir skidded to a halt, realizing the woman looked exactly like his mother in every discernible physical way. The only difference he could determine was the woman's voice, which was much too high to be his mother's. His mother had always been an alto, not a soprano. "Falkir!" the woman called joyously as she wrapped her arms around him in a crushing hug, pinning his arms to his side and causing him to drop the sword. It felt like he was caught in the middle of two budding kaprovri, the large goat-like animals that lived in abundance in the mountains near Falkir's childhood home. This is a surprisingly powerful hug, Falkir reflected. The woman continued, "I've been waiting for you to get here for so long, but you finally arrived!" I hate to ruin this moment, Falkir choked out, "but I can't breathe." She let go of him immediately, and he took a deep breath when he felt his feet hit the ground. He hadn't even noticed being lifted off his feet. "Who are you and why were you waiting for me?" he demanded, annoyed by the rough treatment he'd been given. "Me? I am called Spand Armad," she announced proudly. "Spand isn't a woman's name." Falkir felt very confused by it all. This person had sounded urgent when she called him. Why had she been waiting for him? Surely she wanted more than just a hug and to see his face. The woman laughed, feeling her face and pulling some of her hair in front of her eyes. "I apologize. I completely forgot that I'd taken this form." Suddenly, her hair faded from black to whiter than snow, her skin began losing its tautness, and her features began straying from femininity. The young woman was now a very old man. "Surprised, aren't you?" "Why are you still wearing a dress?" Falkir blurted out. In the change from woman to man, the clothes hadn't changed. The old man still wore the same brown and green garments. "This is not a dress, you impertinent sack of cow dung, it's a robe," Spand shouted, his face a countenance of pure rage. "And I've had to wear it all this time that I've been waiting for you to arrive here, so don't you dare patronize me, or I swear I'll rip your bowels through your eye socket with my bare hands." Falkir was taken aback. Spand had seemed so happy and kind just seconds ago. How angry could mistaking the old man's robe for a dress possibly make him? The rage on Spand's face suddenly faded into serenity, as if he had never been mad. "I have been waiting here all of this time because I have been given the incredibly important duty of telling you this." "Tell me what?" Falkir's heart began racing. If Spand's duty of telling Falkir was important, then he could only imagine the importance of the information itself. Falkir would finally find out what he was doing in this endless meadow and why he had been called here so desperately. He bent down to pick the sword up from the ground where he dropped it during Span's crushing greeting. What he was about to find out was bound to have something to do with this amazing weapon that Falkir had found moments after arriving in the meadow. Span looked Falkir in the eyes, a warm smile spreading across his face. He took a deep breath and then began. You, Falkir Inalumen, are... A drop of cold water woke Falkir from his dream. He opened his eyes into the darkness. The coarse burlap blanket draped over the lower portion of his body was minimal protection from the freezing wind blowing through the barred window above Falkir's bed. Stray beams of moonlight found their way into the room, and the image of the quarter moon in the trees could be seen in a puddle of melted snow on the floor. He was no longer in the meadow, but rather in his cell in the Lord's prison. The stone walls, the footsteps of the patrolling guards, and the iron bars covering every open space were all too familiar to Falkir. They surrounded him and silently mocked him with their stark coldness. They told him that the rest of the world considered him one of the worst people alive. They told him that there was no one in the world that wanted him or would ever want to associate with him. His equals lay all around him, rolling over in half-sleep, unable to escape the environment for a few hours even through dreams. The only people whose crimes were thought worse than Falkir's had already been executed. He was all but forgotten by the rest of society. Falkir had his fair share of chances to escape. An open door, a turned back, a leaving carriage, a weak spot in the walls. Falkir had all of those opportunities, but he never took any of them, no matter how tempting they were. He closed the door, tapped the shoulder, watched the carriage, and fixed the wall. It wasn't that he was hoping he would be released if he kept out of trouble that kept him from escaping. There had been many times where he had encouraged small fights while they were in the corridors between meals. It was the only source of entertainment within the stone walls. Everything else was stone walls and iron bars. If he escaped from these walls, Falkir always told himself, he would actually do something worth imprisonment. None of the other prisoners knew why he was trapped with them. Falkir was too embarrassed to tell anyone, even the men he considered his closest comrades through their ordeal. The guards that knew had been hushed by his accusers so that it wouldn't slip out, and if any of them came close to saying his crime, they were promptly reassigned. The only thing the guards could say is that Falkir had been in a position of opposition towards the king, but not a serious enough infraction for him to be executed. A sour lump welled up in Falkir's gut every time he thought of the government's ability to hold a man for such a simple mistake. Falkir could remember very clearly when he came. It was the summer of his 19th year, and his village was celebrating every summer-born, from infants to the elderly. Nobody in the villages could keep accurate records of the date people were born, so there was a celebration in the middle of each season for everyone. Falkir had been away from the village for a long time, acting as a scribe in the court libraries, and the entire village had been excited about his return. Midway through the festivities, while Falkir was in the tavern with his parents and friends, a group of armed men burst in and seized him. They violently dragged Falkir out and threw him into a cage on the back of a carriage in which other men were being transported. His father ran after the men, demanding to know why his son was being taken. One of the larger guards struck Falkir's father across the temple with a gauntleted fist, calling him a foolish peasant. Then the men calmly got on the carriage and embarked for the prison. As they rode off, Falkir could see his father on the ground, and the entire village gathered around, watching the cart ride off. None dared to stop the men. That was the last of Falkir's family that he had ever seen. According to a letter that a friend from the village had sent a few years ago, the blow to the head his father sustained had cracked his skull. His mother had disappeared from the village a few days after the burial, driven mad by the loss. His sister had been married off in a distant village a few years prior and had been held down by children, so she didn't hear about Falkir's imprisonment or their father's death until months later. His brothers had been assimilated into the Grant Korean military and lost their identities as anything but soldiers. Thinking about it, Falkir sighed, amazed how quickly 6 years had gone by. In the darkness, Falkir heard a mouse scurry across the floor and into a hole in the wall. He envied its freedom. He wished he could come and go as he pleased just to get some food. Not that the food here was very appetizing. The prisoners were mostly served stale bread that not uncommonly carried mold, and water that tasted like it had been fished from the latrines. Many prisoners tried to add protein to the diet by capturing the plentiful rodents. It was not the most appealing diet, but if someone wanted to survive their term in shackles, they had to put up with it. The only time the diet changed was on days of religious celebration, where the prisoners were granted rations of the food the guards would eat on a normal day: fresh rolls, fresh water, and a piece of beef. Those days also allowed time to fraternize with the other prisoners in a carefully watched room during their designated time for crafting the items which were sold to add revenue for the treasury. Typically, the craft you were designated to was whatever profession you had done as a free man, but since they didn't want prisoners reading or writing, Falkir was not allowed to do scribe work. Instead, he decided to learn leatherworking. Most of the leather crafts prisoners made, scabbards, shields, and armor, went to the prisoners' guards and to the Korean army's newest recruits. The main reason Falkir had chosen leatherworking was so that he would be able to break up the monotony of prison life by talking not only with the other leatherworkers, but by occasionally going to the forge and talking to the blacksmiths. For apparent reasons, the forge was heavily guarded, so any visits Falkir made to the blacksmiths had to be short and businesslike to discuss shared projects like scabbards for swords. Even those discussions were welcome when outside of the isolation of his cell. Falkir quickly rolled over and feigned sleep when he heard footsteps coming down the hall toward his cell. The guards didn't like people being awake at night. To them, it was too much of a risk that people would be plotting to escape. If anyone was found awake, the guards woke the entire cell block and gathered everyone together to watch as they whipped the unfortunate insomniac. If anyone turned away, closed their eyes, or simply didn't show up to the whipping, then they were put to the whip as soon as the guards were done. Falkir had learned this fact quickly and only bore scarred welts from one night 5 years ago. The footsteps stopped outside the barred door of Falkir's cell. Falkir's hair stood on end as he heard his door being unlocked. It creaked open slowly, and footsteps progressed into the cell towards the bed where Falkir lay. Every muscle in Falkir's body tensed as he clutched his eyes tight and kept as still as possible. He hoped that if he continued feigning sleep, then he would be left alone. The light dimmed on Falkir's face as the footsteps stopped, blocking the moonlight streaming from the barred window. Falkir felt hands rest on his back, and then he felt himself being violently shaken. "Wake up, friend," a voice whispered out of the darkness. And so ends the first chapter of The Dragon's Rising. I hope you've enjoyed this sample, and if you would like to read more, go to the Amazon links in the description below to purchase your own copy on Kindle or in paperback. Thank you.